My name is Oz. I'm from the Grand Rapids Public Library. And today we're joined here with Delia Fernandez, who's a Michigan State University professor. And we're going to be talking about education in the city of Grand Rapids, and the difficulties and challenge that Latinos face. Quick recap, we have 3 altars at the Grand Rapids Public Library, main branch and Madison Square branch, and one at the Cook Library Center. And that's in partnership with them. And altars are created by Reina Garcia, who's a local artist and great community leader. These altars will showcase COVID-19 victims that recently passed away or community leaders that made an impact in our community. Please visit those. They're going to be in showcase from October 25th to November 3rd through the duration of the celebration of Day of the Dead. And then this program will be completely in English. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Osvaldo. Un placer que estén junto con nosotros. Este programa va a ser completamente en inglés. Luego pueden ir a YouTube y poner subtítulos en español para que así puedan ver el programa en su lenguaje. Si tienen alguna pregunta en español, siéntanse conformes en ponerlo en los comentarios para que así yo pueda tomar la pregunta y se la traduzco a Delia al final de la presentación y le podemos contestar sus preguntas. Alright, sorry about that. Sound was messed up at the beginning.
That's okay.
Oopsies, we're live. So, I was saying that if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section. So I'll be there while Delia does her presentation, and then we'll answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you for all of those that were saying like, oh no, there's no sound. I appreciate you. Sorry about that. I'll let Delia Fernandez start and introduce herself. Hi Delia, thank you for being here with us today.
Hi, thank you so much. Again, I want to thank Oz, who is working his hardest on making this happen. Everybody at GRPL, also Julie Tabor, who are always thinking of me and this work. Um, I'll just say a couple things before we get started. I am originally from Grand Rapids. I'm Mexican and Puerto Rican. And what I'm presenting today is part of a book long project that I have been working on for 10 years this year. And the book will hopefully be published sometime next year. So, this is the last chapter of the book. The larger project looks at how Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and come together and start to build a community and challenge some of the discrimination they face in Grand Rapids via placemaking, this way of making space for themselves in a place that is really hasn't really been hospitable to their presence. And so I look at this last chapter on education as kind of an educational placemaking. How did people address their needs, their students' needs, young people's needs, and what routes did they go about trying to make change for themselves and for future generations? So, with that, I guess I'll get started. And just to know, I want to make sure we're all on the same page when I'm talking about equitable education. I didn't say equal because I think sometimes we get a little sidetracked when we want equal education, meaning the same for everybody. But what parents and students were after was equitable education, education that addressed the injustices that have happened in the past, and education that gave them a path forward for the future. So to start, I want to share a story of Jose Reina. This is Jose Reina is a Mexican American man now who works in the city of Grand Rapids. But in the late 1970s, he was a high school student. He lived in Grand Rapids with his mom and his siblings, and he was actually a really great student and a very talented wrestler at Central High School. But his guidance counselor told him that he should probably sign up for the military, that would have been probably the best choice for him for his future. And they offered very little guidance on going to college. And Jose remembered that he was telling all the Latina girls to go become secretaries and wasn't really talking about college with them. And he remembers the day when kind of his educational path changed, and it was when he was reading. And I can't remember if he was in the library or just reading, kind of in the corner of the school by himself when he ran into, or she ran into him, Carmen Fite. She's a Puerto Rican woman. She was a trained cosmetologist turned educational activist. who was organizing a new school called the Neighborhood Education Center. And she thought that Jose would be a wonderful student to attend some of the programs that they had there, where he could get the one on one kind of guidance that he needed so he could study topics that interested him. And he did. He attended the Neighborhood Education Center, usually for their summer programming. And Jose went on to go to Grand Valley State College at the time, and he ended up being a wrestler for them. But had it not been for Carmen Pite, he's not really sure where he would have been. And the problem that Jose is citing here, this lack of counseling, was just one of the problems that Latino students faced in the 1960s and 70s. And that's really where I'm concentrating this presentation on. I do have more information on what it was like for students before this time that we can talk about in the Q&A if anybody's interested. But beyond a lack of what students and parents were calling culturally competent counselors, meaning people who could understand the students' Latino background and help them make decisions about their future. They also cited a lack of bilingual and bicultural teachers. It wasn't just enough that they had teachers who could speak Spanish. Rather, they wanted teachers who also understood them and understood their culture and the role that it played in their lives. And then lastly, they were interested in both bilingual education and actually bicultural education. Again, they wanted education that was in Spanish, that could help monolingual Spanish speaking students, but also they wanted education that was about Latinos or that included Latinos, because so much of of the curriculum did not make any mention of Latinos at all. So all of this combined to make a staggering attrition rate. A lot of people refer to this as the dropout rate, but for our purposes, we're going to talk about it as either an attrition rate or a push out rate. Because what many of the students were arguing then was that this was not necessarily something that they really felt they had a choice in, that all paths were steering them to getting GEDs or not completing school at all. And so the attrition rate by the 1970s was fluctuated between 50 and 67%. So less than a third sometimes of the Latino students who started high school did not finish high school in Grand Rapids. There, at the time, they made up about 5% of the city. But what this brings up is that a large swath of the population was going to be without a high school education, and therefore locked out of college education if something wasn't done and wasn't done quickly. So I want to kind of put this in the larger context of the issues that come about when you're looking at Latinos, the history of Latinos in education. There's so many stories about Latinos in education that we could tell about Michigan. We have such a rich history. We have a long-standing, large migrant population in the state, and we've had it for almost 100 years. And migrant education is one of the ways, or one topic that folks could study. And this intersected with many of the students in Grand Rapids Public Schools at the time, because many of them were former migrant students, or migrant workers, and then students. In other places, like in Detroit, work by Nora Salas, another historian, looks at busing for integration, where Mexicans or Chicano students are used to kind of to say that integration has happened when Chicano and Black students were forced into schools with one another, because they were saying that Chicanos were racially white. When Chicanos, that's what the school district said, when Chicanos said that no, in fact, they were brown, they were Chicanos. There's a great amount of literature on walkouts and how students had ended up walking out and protesting the same types of issues all over the country. And also as also Nora Salas shows us, also in Michigan, they took this tactic. Um, and then even in Grand Rapids, in histories of the city, we've seen from historian Todd Robinson, he coins a term called the lost generation. And that's when Black students were also pushed out at exorbitantly high rates. And essentially, some of them, what they amounted to was a lost generation, a generation of students who didn't have access to equitable education opportunities and then social mobility and social progress in that traditional way. And so, what I'm arguing about Latinos in education in Grand Rapids is that without addressing the issues of bilingual and bicultural education and teachers and counselors, Latinos also had a lost generation of students who did not have access to the resources they needed to be successful. But educational activists, both parents, students, and other community members, used a form of institutional activism to address the needs that Latino students had to get them what they needed. And so, institutional activism, and what I mean by that is that they worked within the system. So many other places, Latinos were walking out, they were staging massive protests. And that's not something that we see in Grand Rapids. One, because of the conservative nature of the city, but also because of the smaller Latino population, where those tactics aren't necessarily, they don't exactly produce the results that activists intended for them to produce. And so, institutional activism, working within the system, working with state agencies, as we'll see here, and working with both Black and white allies helps Latinos to get what they need for their students. And especially, it was women, especially, who took on leadership roles and who made these transformations necessary in Grand Rapids. So, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about three topics. One is the issues. I'm going to go over the issues in a little bit more detail. And then I'm going to talk about grassroots solutions to these issues, the ways that everyday people and grassroots community organizations came together to address those issues. And then I'll also talk about how those issues or those tactics got institutionalized so that they were secure, at least for a couple of years, for these Latino students in Grand Rapids. So what I have here are excerpts from a report from a community organization called the Latin American Council, which I'll describe in more detail later, and a meeting with them and representatives from the Board of Education. And basically by the 1970s, both GRPS and Latinos in Grand Rapids were in agreement that there really were no Latino teachers, or not enough Latino teachers, counselors, and even staff members. And so you'll see here on the top left corner, Mr. Schremer, who was a social studies coordinator, spoke on the teacher situation as it pertains to the Latin Americans. At present, there are 6 teachers and 1 administrator employed by the Board of Education. And so there were about 900 students at this time, and only 6 teachers. And so this meant that the chances of a Latino student having a Latino teacher were very, very low. And again, a lot of what activists were hoping for was an increase in representation, under the guise that representation would help Latino students stay in school more. Without Latino students, both Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuban at the time, while they were in school, when they did not see people who looked like them as teachers and principals and staff members, and many activists argued that the students were coming to the conclusion that this was not actually a place for them, that education was not something that was for them. And so arguing for more teachers based on the fact that there were only 6 Latino teachers in the district for 900 students was a really strong point. And this also fit in with the statistics for the rest of the state. Another grassroots organization found that there were across the state, the student to teacher ratio between white students and white teachers were 20 students to every 1 teacher. So this meant that there were the chances that white students could have a white teacher were actually relatively high. And it was 34 students to 1 teacher for African American students and teachers. But for Latinos, the chances were, for every 1 Latino teacher, there were 89 students in the district, meaning that the chance for them to actually see a Latino teacher in their building or in their classroom were actually very, very low. There just weren't enough teachers to go around, Latino teachers to go around. But it wasn't just in teaching, right? Counseling was the other issue. So at the bottom left of the screen, again, there's a definite need for Latin American counselors in the Grand Rapids school system. The requirement for a school social worker is much higher. This requires a master's in social and school social work, which entails 60 semester hours. The demand for Latin American school social workers is great, but the supply is not. One of the issues that GRPS had cited in terms of finding both qualified teachers and social workers was that there's just not enough of them in the area. They argued that they needed to recruit more, and they did. They tried recruiting from places like Texas to bring in teachers into the area and social workers into the area, but many of them did not want to stay. One of the things they hadn't addressed, though, is that with such staggering attrition rates and push out rates, the idea that, or many of the GRPS officials said that they needed to recruit from within the city with Latinos who were born and raised in Grand Rapids and wished to stay there. But the problem was that with the attrition rate being so high, the pool of available Latinos going to college was small. And then of those who went to college to get to ask them to be teachers, and then of those who wanted to be teachers, of those who wished to stay in Grand Rapids. And so yes, the pool became very, very small, and it was very much a cyclical problem that was happening. And it was also not just within the certified positions that led folks to think that there was also some discriminatory factors in hiring, because to quoted here in the middle, to date, there are no Latin Americans functioning secretarial capacities in the area of school bus drivers. It was pointed out that these positions are supplemental wage positions. Of the current 104 bus driver positions, there are none held by Latin Americans. And so the district was having an issue with hiring Latinos, either for certified or non-certified positions. And to be fair, the entire city was having an issue. While Latinos had been in the area since at least in this larger community number since the 1940s, by the 1970s, there were little to no employees, city employees who were Latino, including the police and fire department, which had none by the 1970s, early 1970s at least. So the issue, there was definitely a discriminatory issue in hiring, but then also there's a pool, an issue of an available supply of teachers that was really created by some of their own discriminatory hiring practices as well. The other issue, the last issue I'll talk about in terms of, we talked about teachers and counselors, but bicultural and bilingual education comes in the form of textbook and curriculum. So what I have here are sources from an excerpt from the meeting that I spoke about on the earlier slide, and that says, so however, in secondary levels, the materials are outdated as compared with what is currently available. Materials on Blacks have been updated and utilize visual aids, but this has not happened in the area of Latin American studies. There is some emphasis on the learning of standard English, but not much attention to the contribution of the Latin Americans as a group. It goes on to talk about what's available at Burton Junior High and each school. But at least the social studies coordinator knew that we needed updated materials. And that was in 1971. And by 1975, when the district had purchased new books, the books contained errors about Latin Americans. And that for many really felt like disrespectful, because the errors in the books that they had purchased were spelling errors of Spanish words. It was one thing to include them, but it was another thing or include Spanish words, but it was another thing to spell them incorrectly. It just seemed like a lack of respect for the language that so many people in the community spoke. And they also had started their section on Latinos, called them settlers in transition, and proliferated this idea that Latinos, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans were people who came to Michigan very recently and were always migrating. And while there are many migratory communities or communities who engage in migratory work, we've had Latinos in Michigan since the 1920s, and many of the activists, educational activists, knew that. And it helped to really perpetuate this idea that Latinos were foreign. So they really, both parents and students rejected this characterization of that their textbooks were putting on about Latinos. The other issue of bilingual education was really one of the most, really the most impactful issue, because up until 1968, we didn't have any laws that allowed for bilingual education and the funding of bilingual education across the country. And so up until then, many students were involved or were involved in a program where they were essentially not taught anything and not taught in a different language, or not getting any services in their native language. They were just put behind a couple of years. That was something that was really common. If you got there and you were in third grade in Puerto Rico, when you got to Grand Rapids, you would be in first grade. And they said, okay, the first year you're just learning the language. The second year you're learning what everybody else is learning. And then you go on after that. So one person in particular was very helpful in trying to create a bilingual education program after 1968, and that was Luis Murillo. He was one of the few and longtime Latino educators working for Grand Rapids Public Schools. So he was involved in trying to come up with a program that works. And as you can see from this list of teachers, these were the 6 teachers who were in Grand Rapids in the 1970s. Many of them were at Hall Elementary School, which is now Cesar Chavez. That's where many the neighborhood in which many Latinos lived, where many of the students attended, very much like now. But at the time, they had the most monolingual Spanish-speaking students and the most teachers, but still not enough. It was up to Luis Murillo at the time in the 1970s to propose a new formation of how we could address these issues. So here is just an example of the type of work that Luis Murillo was doing to try to revolutionize bilingual education, to try to make it more accessible to all of Hall Elementary students, to all of them who are there. And he's going through the way that he envisioned the program would look in this 1971 proposal. It really wasn't until 1974 when we had some enforcement of the Bilingual Education Act, meaning that schools had to provide. Up until 1974, it was voluntary for schools to participate. And Murillo was very intent on trying to persuade GRPS to carry out a more comprehensive bilingual program, not just at Hall School. He did make a proposal for Hall, but he also, in this very long document, made a proposal for several other schools and how to get those students the bilingual education that they needed. So now we'll turn to some of the grassroots solutions that Latinos carried out to do this. So these solutions were carried out by specific organizations. The first is the Latin American Council. This organization started in the mid-1960s by Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. It ended up winning funding for their programs through anti-poverty federal programming through what's called the Model Cities program. They were funded via federal funds given to the city in later years. But they really developed, while they started as a volunteer-based organization, once they had federal funding, they expanded and were able to be a really comprehensive social service, cultural and a cultural center, and also a base for activism. I mean, they had at Latin American Council, they had everything from like well baby visits to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings there. They could help you find a job. They could help you find clothing. They could get you connected to food resources. But they also held movie screenings. They had a youth group. They taught, in the youth group, they taught Latino youth how to do dances, traditional dances, how to cook, in particular, Mexican, Puerto Rican, and Cuban styles. They were really They really addressed a variety of needs, but they were also a base for activism. And so many, like in terms of electoral politics, many people worked with them if they were going to run for local Grand Rapids politics. But education was one of their biggest areas because that was, they had dedicated staff members to that. And so when we talk about solutions, it's many of their educational staff, like Carmen Fite, who she started with the Latin American Council, who took up trying to create solutions to the issues Latino students were facing. In addition, there was also La Lucha. This was a student organization that operated out of Grand Valley State College at the time. This was made up, it was not very big, probably maybe 5 to 10 members. And it was made up of really most of the Latino students who were at Grand Valley in the 1970s at the time. Many of them were from Grand Rapids. They had went through GRPS and they were some of the few to graduate and go on to college. So they were very familiar with the type of atmosphere that Latino students were facing there. And they helped with the Latin American Council. In addition, La Raza Advisory Committee, this started as a kind of a committee that worked across the state made up of parents and teachers and community members, clergy members. And it got institutionalized actually and became an advisory board to the State Board of Education. So they would collect data about the situation for Latinos across the state, and then help to make suggestions and recommendations to the State Board of Education. But they were also involved in helping to come up with the solution to the issues of counseling, of teacher shortages, counseling shortages, and bilingual and bicultural education. So one of the ways that organizers decided to address the teacher shortage was to increase the amount of Latino paraprofessionals, which are also known as teachers' aides. They operate still in classrooms today, but most of the time teachers' aides are not certified teachers, but they have, some of them may have training in education or others get training while they're on the job there. And it is no surprise that the majority of these people who signed up to be paraprofessionals were women. Education has long been an area that women have been kind of gravitated to, but also kind of socialized to go to that. Um, Education, especially for elementary students, is along the line of caretaking that women, especially Latinas, have often been charged with doing the work of taking care of children and providing in that way for the community. So if you'll look at the list, many of these first paraprofessionals were longtime members of the communities or families or a part of families that were longtime members of the community who later went on to do other things. But if you're also a longtime member of Grand Rapids community, you'll recognize the name like Maria Isasi, whose family came in the 1940s, Hortensia Arazola, whose family also came about that time, Isabel Navarro, she was part of the El Matador chip company, her husband Miguel, with her husband Miguel. There's also my aunt is on here. It's Rosalia Fernandez is up there, an aide at Jefferson. And the idea behind these paraprofessionals was that if we cannot get certified Latino teachers into the classroom, we need to have some Latinos in the school setting so that our students know that school is a place that they should feel welcome. School is a place that they can see themselves in. And so having these Latinas and some men like Emilio Nieto, and there's another man on here as well, having them in there shows them that this is a place that is for them. And so this becomes a short-term solution to getting Latino faces in the classroom. It is not, however, enough for the entire, it's not a foolproof solution because many of the teachers' aides are used at the elementary level, but we still have middle school and high school students to worry about, and they are the ones who are at the closest to the time of attrition, right? If they're gonna decide to leave school, it's not in kindergarten, it's not in 5th grade, it's in 10th grade where we need the extra reinforcement. So while this was helpful and very much did make a difference for many of those students, it still was not enough. And that's the trend that we see, that these grassroots efforts were really important, but still not enough. In terms of counselors, the idea that the Latin American Council came up with is having their youth coordinator start to take on the role of a counselor. So this is from the Latin American Council's monthly report that they turned into the city every month. And this is the youth program coordination report on what was happening. So if you see the second paragraph, in addition to her youth club advising activities, Rachel Campos, who's the youth, one of the longstanding youth coordinators, the youth program coordinator has spent considerable time this month in meeting with school administrators, parents, and students who have been involved in disciplinary problems in junior and senior high schools. She has counseled 3 high school students who plan to drop out regarding their future plans and prospects, arranged English language tutoring for 3 more, and has arranged part-time employment for 2 others. So Rachel Campos was a Mexican-American woman who was raised in the area. And her responsibilities included coordinating a Latino youth program, Latin American Youth in Action, which you can see in that first paragraph. It was bringing in speakers, activities that were held inside the Latin American Council's outings, but then she started to take on the role as a counselor, even though she didn't necessarily have a social work degree, but she took on the role of interventionist at that point. And the fact that in 1 month, her report from 4 weeks, from the 1st to the 29th, she was able to help 7 or so or 8 students make plans that their own counselors with master's degrees hadn't done for them, shows the impact of how important these types of interventions were and how important it was for Latino families to have somebody who understood them to be able to make that intervention. Of course, the education coordinator who would eventually be hired also took on this work as well, David Rodriguez, who later became one of the first Latinos on the school board. But with only them 2, and then eventually they got a 3rd, it still was not enough considering how many students were there. And then also the fact that more students were coming into the late 1970s. So a good plan, but still needed more. This is an excerpt from the chapter that I wrote on education. And this is about Luis Murillo's, his commitment to students. So even though he had asked for an expansion of the bilingual education program at Hall School and an expansion into other schools, while he was waiting for that reply, quote, rather than wait interminably for GRPS to gather the resources for a bilingual education plan, Luis Murillo and the LIC staff members drew upon their community to establish a bilingual program. Utilizing LIC facilities, Murillo taught English classes on Saturdays, reaching students who could not access the bilingual education program, but still needed those services. In 1 month, he taught 16 children, quote, none of whom had a rudimentary skill in English, as he wrote in a report for the council. So instead of just waiting, he just started to take this on himself, which it's considering there were 900 students, for him to have 16 on a Saturday, right, is not an entire a lot, but also what literally one person could do on a Saturday at the Latin American Council. So while these were not as far reaching as they needed them to be, they show the importance of the Latin American Council and La Lucha, who supported these efforts, and making sure that some way, somehow, Latino students would get some of the attention they needed. And now I turn to the institutionalization of some of these methods. So this came through was called the Neighborhood Education Authority. This was a statewide program that was created under the administration of John Porter, that he's on your left there. He was the first Black superintendent of schools for the state of Michigan. He was also the youngest superintendent of schools in the state of Michigan, actually across the country, and also one of the first superintendent of schools a Black superintendent of schools across the country. There hadn't been another, the first couple of ones were in the late 1800s. So it had been a very long time since anywhere had a Black head of schools, but we had one in Michigan in the 1970s. And Porter authorized the creation of this neighborhood education authority. And what it was, the main objective of the NEA, as I'll refer to it here, was to quote, continuing the education of those individuals throughout the state who, for whatever reason, have been unable to complete their high school education. So to complete this task, the NEA also included provisions in its plan for neighborhood education centers. And so these would be local schools that operated on a very, very local level. Porter put in charge of this Elijah Delbert Gray. And so his dissertation is, you see a picture of the cover of his dissertation on the right, which he wrote his dissertation on these schools that he was in charge of. So these neighborhood educations would function, and neighborhood education centers, or NECs, would function as basically alternative or independent schools where people could apply for, community organizations could apply for grants from the NEA to host their own school. And you did not have to be a part of a school district. And this was key because for so many parents across the state, especially parents of Black and Latino students, their traditional school district had not been meeting their needs for decades. And so for parents to be able to access state funding without having to go through their local school district, both Porter and Gray created a way for these Latino and Black students to still have access to public education. In other places, they had independent schools that functioned off of private dollars or community fundraising. This was different. This was provided by the state. So this was a way to preserve the public good, but also without disrupting mainstream K-12 education. And it was actually through Delbert Gray, Elisha Delbert Gray, that the city of Grand Rapids gets its first or gets its turn at a neighborhood education center. Carmen Fite was one of the main organizers for the NEC, or El Centro. That's also what they called it because they referred to it in Spanish. So they just, in short, El Centro. She was the one who found Jose Reina reading at Central and saw that he had so much potential that was not being used. Fite herself, I think, like I said in the beginning, was actually a trained cosmetologist. She was from Puerto Rico by way of New York. She had lived in New York and was married, and together with her partner, her husband, she moved to Grand Rapids. And she started, she didn't know very many people there and she wanted to get involved. So she started attending the Latin American Council, or she started frequenting the council and getting involved. And she was gravitating towards issues of education. For her, it was very personal. When she moved from Puerto Rico to New York as a teenager, she said, quote, "It was really hard going to high school and not knowing the language. I learned the hard way. I didn't have tutors or anything like that." So she was really interested in trying to help other students not have that same experience. And Fite also was not a parent at the time, but she really saw many of the students in her neighborhood and her community as part of her own. So she had been a paraprofessional, eventually worked as an education coordinator for the Latin American Council. And it was during that time where she heard about this grant program, the Neighborhood Education Authority, and she applied to the program, first in 1971 unsuccessfully, and then again in 1972. R. Michael Haviland, a white ally who worked at the Latin American Council, assisted her in putting together this this grant application. And she said, Fites admitted, "At the time, I did not have much knowledge of how it all worked in terms of how to secure a state grant." But she actually ended up working really closely with Elijah Gray, the director of the NEA. And in reflecting on it, She said, I thought we were really blessed to have someone there, someone who was interested in helping the kids in this area. And I think it's really important here to think about both white and Black allies and the roles they play in helping the Latino community. In Grand Rapids, where Latinos made up a very small portion of the entire city, these allies were really important for all of their fights against discrimination. Sympathetic white allies who could use their privilege and their resources to help along causes were very helpful, including like that of Haviland's. But Black allies were also really important at this time. One thing to consider is that in many issues of education where Latinos and African Americans were lumped together by districts and made to share resources, they've had to differentiate themselves from one another in order to garner more resources from their districts, from their cities. But this particular issue in creating a neighborhood education center did not cause both Black and Latino activists to do such a thing. In other issues in Grand Rapids, it did, and I can talk about those later as well. But in this case, you see middle-class African-American men, Porter and Gray, who created these programs that could reach a large group of people who had been marginalized, but then also working personally with Fite herself to get them access to it. So we can see how one group can open the door for another to get the resources that they need, and that these don't always have to be contentious relationships. So they got the grants. In 1973, el Centro de Educación, or el Centro, or the NEC, opened. So you can see students there, Neighborhood Education Center students celebrate opening of their school. So at first, this was a very small school. It was in a basement of Fountain Street Church for a little bit. It then went to Maplewood Elementary, eventually to Franklin. I really like the size of a classroom until they eventually had their own building. But they started with 15 students in the first year, and by the second year, we're up to 85 students. And the way that they staffed the school was very unique. They had community members as teachers in the school. So Carmen Fite herself was the counselor, also at some point worked as in a director capacity. For teachers, they had some community members like Jose Narezo, a famous artist in the area, teaching art. They had some college students who were teaching math and English, and many of them were Latino. They were just on their way to getting degrees. And of course, Narezo and Carmen Fite were Latino themselves. They also had folks like Pedro Roman, another Puerto Rican man, who were helpful in administering the school. So they were able to have the type of representation they wanted in terms of teaching. And then also there were bilingual opportunities for bilingual education and bicultural education in that Carmen Fite, who sometimes taught literature and all of these other subjects, allowed for students to read read and do assignments in languages that they were comfortable in. This also meant that students could, for example, Jose Rena remembered students were, when it came to literature, they remember citing poems that would make, reciting poems that could be in English or Spanish or even Spanglish at a time when that really was looked down upon. Rena also remembered that he was allowed to do a report on the history of rock and roll and how that was interesting to him and kept him engaged in school. Another student who was taking dance at El Centro learned about modern dance as just a genre and found it to be something that was really comforting to her. And so many of the teachers who were cited in talking about the school had said, you know, in terms of our subjects and math and things like that, I don't teach easy math. I teach the same math, but we teach it at a speed that students are comfortable with learning. The students were also responsible for one of our earliest pieces of cultural production in the city. This is on Granville Avenue. Still, it's very, very faded now. But this was a project that students undertook under the direction of Jose Rena, the artist. where, I'm sorry, Jose Narezo, the artist, where students used math, art, and social studies to create a representation of their community and to show solidarity with other communities in the area as well. So by and large, the community, El Centro, operated for 5 years until 1978 and was really a point of pride for the community. This was something that everybody had noted, that this school started without any help from the city, without any help from Grand Rapids Public Schools. But in 1978, things happened that were outside of their control. Events transpired. The Latin American Council at one point merged with El Centro de Educación and became the Latin American Council and the Educational Cultural Center. And the NEC was then, it was likely so that they could share resources, as resources were getting very tight for the Latin American Council at the time. And when the Latin American Council ended up having accounting issues, a scandal, and a very, very public arguments and fights, the council started to lose funding and eventually dissolved. And when that happened, by no fault of its own, the Neighborhood Education Center had to get handed over. First, it had to separate from the council, and then it had to get handed over to Grand Rapids Public Schools. The state ordered it to be handed over in 1978. It was about this time that Carmen Fite had also left the organization. She had been there for years, but the Grand Rapids Public Schools, over the course of those 5 years, started to give a little bit of money every year to the Neighborhood Education Center. And with that money, they wanted it to be the Neighborhood Education Center to open up to, or to not have so much of a focus on Latino students. And that was hard for Fite, because Fite really, there had always been non-Latino students at the Neighborhood Education Center, but those values of bilingual, bicultural education, Latino teachers, Latino counseling were so central to what the school was about. Having to change it became very hard for her. And so at that time, the Latin American Council and both the NEC dissolved. GRPS absorbed many of those students and the same programming, the very district that wouldn't meet their needs before. But at the time, by the late 1970s, white flight had meant that many of GRPS's students by that time were majority Black and Latino, or at least more Black and Latino than they were 10 to 20 years prior. And so while this is definitely a story of decline, it is, what we see is a growth in how, or what we see is these trends in education and what Latino parents wanted for their students continue on. So in 1996, we saw the opening of Adelante High School that operated until, I think, 2012, which was for bilingual and monolingual Spanish-speaking students aged 15 to 19 who were in danger of not completing school, which was the same target group that the NEC had created, or was created for. And while Adelante closed, we see in its stead Southwest Community Campus formed, bilingual, bicultural school that started as, elementary and then goes from pre-K to 8, and which is now a high school. But one thing is for sure, that everything that Latino parents and students and educators have gotten in Grand Rapids, they have fought for and they have provided on their own before anybody else provided other resources. And it is likely that they will continue to have to fight for the same resources, or in the same way that parents did in years prior. So I'll end there.
There we go. This time around, I will not forget that the audio is disabled. Welcome back. Let's see. If anyone has any questions, we'll give you guys about 3-4 minutes so that you can post them on the comment section. So feel free to ask us any questions. I gotta say, it was really interesting and refreshing to see how little by little, with little things, the community gathers and can create so much, or set so many things in motion to benefit the community, especially when you create allies, and there's allies that not even if you identify as a Hispanic or any other identification, that you can support and help other people, and that set things in motion, and here we are right now. And then also we had a panel recently um, for the importance of bilingual education and how important it is to have um, that interaction in students, especially in parents that sometimes at home they don't speak a certain language, and then the kids just speak English, and when they come home they lose that cultural element of what identifies them as Hispanics. And so we had a really good discussion with community leaders around that. So if you missed it, feel free to watch it on YouTube. All right, so we have a question from Familia Orozco. Says, very interesting. Thank you for sharing. I wonder how the 900 students to 6 Latino teachers back in the day compares to what it is today.
I unfortunately do not have any education or any current statistics offhand, but I will say that what I've seen, at least in Southwest Community Campus, which I should also say, I worked at Southwest when I lived in Grand Rapids when I was in college, so I'm most familiar with their program. Is that one of the things that they have also done is try to recruit Latino teachers, and that includes going to Puerto Rico, getting people from Dominican Republic, from other places across the country to get student or to get teachers there, so that so many of their teachers don't just speak Spanish, but they're culturally competent as well.
Thank you for your question, Familia Orozco. We appreciate it. So I have a question of my own.
Okay. Yeah.
and this comes in as an educator and also as a student myself still. Um, what are some maybe tips or tricks that we as Latinos, maybe as allies, we could do right now with the current situation, trying to have access to education that's affordable and obtainable by low income families in Grand Rapids? What can we do as a community? What can we do as people?
I think one really great step is to learn about your resources. There are, since the 1970s, when you had like the Latin American Council and La Lucha working on education issues, there have been so many more organizations that have formed in this time. And so for every level of student, you have different support services that are accessible and can be accessible or can be really accessible, meaning in your neighborhood or can come to the school. So offhand, I think of mentoring as one of the key aspects of success, educational success. It's very helpful when you have somebody who's gone through it to be able to help you, to show you the way. And so I know at Southwest, again, because I'm most familiar with them, they have a nonprofit called Affinity Mentoring that comes in and works with their students and offers mentors to students. I have friends who have been mentors for years to the same students, and those type of connections we know are helpful. But then we also have places like at the Hispanic Center for West Michigan, where they had the SOL program. So I think it's supporting our leader. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's directed at high school students. That can help them with both, I think, employment and please, if I'm misspeaking, please look it up just to be sure. But I remember friends working with those students there and then making connections with college students that way. You also have amazing resources, especially in the Granville Avenue neighborhood, and the Cook Arts Center, and the Granville Avenue Center for Humanities and Arts, or Arts and Humanities as well. Those are great places that people can help you get hooked up with even more resources. So one is to take advantage of what's available within your network.
I agree with that. And if you have any questions or find information, the Grand Rapids Public Library is a really great place. We house the to college folks at the second floor of, well, yeah, it is the second floor. Let's see. Third floor, sorry. Third floor of the library. I have to think about it because it's an old building. It's kind of like divided. But we house through college to college on the third floor, and they're wonderful at connecting high school students or people or youth that want to attain a college education, and they guide you through the whole process. So I would recommend also checking them out. They're wonderful people working there. I have a question also from Nora Salas that is asking, says, did you find your research did you find in your research, any differences between what parents thought the purpose of bilingual education was versus GRPS or people at the state level?
That's a great question. Hey, Nora. Uh, so one of the things that really stood out was the issue of bicultural, that parents and community members were saying bilingual, bicultural, and the district was like, but we have white folks who speak Spanish that can be their teachers. Is that not enough for you? And that was really one of the main issues of contention, and that I think helped the community to articulate their needs more, because it started as just bilingual educators. That was what they wanted, but then you can see the addition of bilingual, bicultural, that they wouldn't use bilingual without using bicultural, and at some point they, at least in the state, for like the La Raza Advisory Committee, they were very clear. They wanted Latino teachers. They didn't mince words as far as like saying, oh, we want somebody who understands our students. No, they wanted Latino teachers. They wanted Latino counselors, people who had experiences that their Latino students could resonate with.
Well, thank you, Nora Salas, for asking that question. And then Orozco is asking also another question. It says there's the same pushback comes from up when actively recruiting teachers from somewhere else. The folks or fellow Latinos do not stay. No se quedan. Why would they not really stay?
So part of the issue, I mean, it's hard. I think that there are a couple things happening. At least in the past, there wasn't a lot of. At the time, they were in the midst of placemaking and making Grand Rapids a more hospitable place for Latinos. The Latin American Council was doing what they could, but when you're coming from a place that has so many more cultural resources and economic resources for Latinos, social resources for Latinos, being in Grand Rapids can be kind of hard. And then the same, I think that carries into the present. If teachers are not supported, if the educators, administrators of these schools are not supported with the resources that they need, and they keep having to fight for basic things, it's going to be impossible to keep them. So it becomes a structural issue, that we have kind of the amenities that people might want, in terms of cultural and social. But if at your job as an educator, if the district, any district, is not providing you with the resources you need for you to be successful and your students to be successful, you're not going to get anybody to stay, and it becomes this ever present problem.
All right, let's see. It seems like there's no further questions. Thank you everyone for joining today. I apologize again for the sound issues at the very beginning, but we are really grateful for having you here today. Thank you, Delia Fernandez, for this great introduction to that history. And then also, I wanted to share for some of the details that we missed at the beginning. We do have an altar showcase for Day of the Dead at 3 Grand Rapids Public locations, well, 2 Grand Rapids public locations, the main branch downtown and then the Madison Square branch. And then in collaboration with the Cook Library Center, we also have another Day of the Dead altar there, and these are created by Reina Garcia. If you do create an altar at home and would like to share your story and your altar, please use at Grand Rapids Public Library by tagging us on social media so you can share your story with us. This is not the end of our programs, so we will keep celebrating Day of the Dead until November 3rd. And GRPL is celebrating 150 years this year. So keep watch for any other pop-up programs or events that we're creating. Yeah, have a great evening, guys. Thank you for joining us. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Az.